For this section two, I decided to do a short video and talk to the slider, which I'll be using in the keynote rather than use text. So the fourth area where we see tension between the current format of disability services provision and social model practices is in the voice of learners who are increasingly sort of discontented with the state of affairs. So there's starting to be a clash of culture between a generation of students that have a specific expectation with regards to inclusion and a system that so far has not been really thinking in terms of inclusion with the aspect of social capital. So in post-secondary, as opposed to the secondary sector, we have thought of inclusion in terms of accommodations, but accommodations being able to be provided outside the classrooms, away from the classroom, through a sort of distinct approach that sets students apart rather than keep them in the classroom. As you know, this is essentially different from what we see in the secondary sector, because in schools, inclusion is very much rooted on around the principle of social capital. The reason why we want to keep students together in the mainstream classroom is because we realize that they gain as much from social capital as they gain from education itself. And so therefore, any inclusive system is not just about giving equal access to the content and to the learning, but to the opportunities and the windows for social capital development. We've not been so far focused on this notion of social capital within higher education. And this is what's creating this clash of culture, because students now arriving from the secondary sector with very clear ideas about the social capital gains, which they want to be able to gain through a mainstream education, and provisions which we have historically provided in higher ed, which really don't focus that much on social capital and are quite willing to focus on inclusion simply as being an accessible sort of retrofitting process that can happen outside their classroom. Some people say, why is this generation so eloquent? It's probably because we are seeing the first generation of students who benefit from the full progress, and path through secondary school in inclusive conditions, benefiting from that social capital. They understand it, they have a very clear idea of what it means, and they want to continue benefiting from this in post-secondary as well. And this means in practice they will be fairly eloquent about not being labeled, not being stigmatized, and also not being pushed into parallel systems, which so far we've had in higher education. So not having to go to an accessibility office, not having to take exams outside their main classroom, not having to go through processes and steps that other students don't have to go through. So I wanted to offer an anecdote from my own days when I was working in disability services. And we still have finals in a lot of Canadian universities, and finals are generally set in gymnasiums or in large halls, because so many students take them at the same time. And we had a student who had a vision impairment who requested to take her exams in the same room as everyone else in the gym. And obviously processes are in place, meaning that if you want enlarged text, it's an accommodation, therefore it's got to be supplied in a separate room, and so forth. So she made a request, it was denied, went to student services, was denied, went to VP of academics, was denied. And this all ended up in a letter to the president of the university, where she claimed very eloquently that all she had as information was access to enlarged text, and that enlarged text could easily be provided in a gymnasium to allow her to stay in the same room as all other students while taking exams. And obviously by then there was such a controversy and publicity that the university sort of folded and accepted, and she took her exams with other students. It's a small anecdote, but it's a good example of the sort of challenges and battles that we see happening these days on a regular basis. And so this clash is not going to go away. And I think our system has to understand that inclusion does mean social capital. Therefore, inclusion does mean remaining in the main classroom with all other peers. And our system at the moment isn't geared for that. And so this is another aspect where we see a lot of tension. I've given you a link there to another case that's been highly mediatized in Ontario, where a student with a mental health issue, a graduate student, refused to have to disclose a full diagnosis before being given access to the accommodations that she required. She was denied this protection of not having to disclose a full diagnosis. She fought it, went to the Human Rights Commission, won the Human Rights Commission, and every university in Ontario has received a letter stating that a letter from a physician or from a psychiatrist stating that accommodations are in place is sufficient and that disclosure of diagnosis is not necessary. What's admirable here is, a student fighting and outing herself publicly, but also eloquently explaining that she's doing it because the system needs to change, and that she's willing to make that sacrifice, that personal sacrifice, to make sure that other students don't end up in the same position as she is. So we're seeing a lot more of this determination from students, and that eloquence, and this need to see things change and to see true inclusion, genuine inclusion, an inclusion that actually rests on principles of social capital and presence in the mainstream classroom, get louder and louder as we function. And this means that really, again, it's one of the ways that we are seeing the current format of disability service provision clashing with social model principles or UDL goals, whereby these services and that design should be provided in the classroom, and therefore allow social capital development at the same time.